Let's review the top M3 Pro versus the base M3 Max from a pro photographer perspective and determine if the $800 price tag to upgrade the silicon and memory together is worth it or not. This is ArtIsRight. Thank you and welcome to those of you who have already subscribed. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so we can grow the channel. One thing that all of you can definitely help me out with is to hit on that like button. This way the algorithm will push this video to an even larger audience. I'll be sharing lots of information. Please pause this video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. Timestamp to the various tests if you want to jump ahead will be in the description. If you enjoy what I'm doing and find this information helpful, please consider supporting the channel. I'll leave a link to my tip jar in the description. YouTube Super Thanks works as well, and something new I'm trying out is a membership to this channel, to which you will get priority replies on any comments or questions you ask on any videos. And if the only thing that you're doing is to subscribe and hitting on that like button, I appreciate all of you the same, so thank you so much. All right. For the primary test system, we are looking at the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Now, the price tag to upgrade these are going to be the same in the 14-inch MacBook Pro as well. If you take a look at this on Apple website, on the stock configuration right now, both of these are stock. The price tag is a delta of $1,000. The amount of this really comes down to a $400 for the silicon, $400 for the memory, and $200 for the SSD. This is the sum and how we got to that $1,000. But if you want to upgrade from the M3 Pro top to the M3 Max base, there's a way to do it by just literally selecting on the M3 Pro for the 16-inch or even just the 14-inch model and just keeping the SSD the same. What you can do is have that 512 and just really upgrade the silicon for $400, and you also have to upgrade the memory as well because the M3 Max base runs on 36 gigabytes of memory. So it's tied in together, to which you are looking at an $800 upgrade between the two. That's something to think about, and it is certainly one of those factors that you can definitely consider doing. Now, with this in mind, we're going to take a look at just the silicon. 12 CPU versus 14. 2 more CPU cores variation doesn't seem that much of a difference until we really dig down into the distribution of it. 6 performance, 6 efficiency versus 10 performance and 4 efficiency. Now, Apple could have really distributed this, for example, in an 8 performance and 4 efficiency configuration on the Pro, but they did not do that. And this is what's really accounting for the Pro performance in the M3 generation. It's okay, it's not that good. But in testing all these machines, the M3 generation Max is really amazing. It's a really great SoC, and this is really attributing to a lot to that. As far as the GPU goes, we started with 18 and we increased it by 12 to 30 in the Max. 16 NPU is the same, and yes, there is a memory bandwidth variation on the spec sheet. The reality of it is that you're not really going to see any difference. I'll leave a link to this video in the description. I've ran extensive testing on this on the M1 Pro, M1 Max generation. Essentially, what it really comes down to right now is the software that we have. None of them are really utilizing the new architecture in these SoC and maxing it out. For something like that to happen, you need to max out the CPU, GPU, NPU, and also RAM all at the same time to really push the system to the limit, and we're not even anywhere close to that yet. Here are some additional test systems. So we are looking at the base M3 Pro and top M3 Max. M1, M2 generation, both the Pro and Max are there, and also the regular silicon SoC as well. In addition to this, we are going to take a look at the M1 Ultra and M2 Ultra. And there are many other videos on my channel. I highly recommend you check them out. Anything that is related to this generation machine that was launched, you can find them in the description as well. I'll have a link there. So everything has been retested with Sonoma 14.1 or 14.1.1. It's a fresh, clean install in the system and is using the current distribute app. These are the apps that you can get to test on your machine, and they're the apps that I have access to as well. These are not any special apps or anything running on this system. As far as the display go, I have tested this out with all the variations of these SoC, M3, M3 Pro, M3 Max, and on these Liquid Retina XDR display with Calibration HL device and Calibration Profiler. It works just fine without any problem. It will also work with external hardware calibrated displays such as BenQ SW Line and Palette Master Ultimate too. So I've tested all of it and it works. If you want a guide on how to best calibrate these displays and learn how to use reference mode, I'll leave a link to this video in the description. It's the ultimate guide on how to calibrate these displays. Now, this will be a pro photo review and a single app testing because I want to see how the silicon are performing against each other and how they're performing one generation to the next. We all multitask, and if you do multitask and if you're crazy like me, just get more RAM for your system. You'll be thankful later on. Now with this test, it's really difficult to test every single variation and configuration because there's so many variety of ways you can configure this machine. So a lot of these are going to be based on data extrapolation. If you want to know how much an increase in memory is going to benefit your machine, knowing the exact number is not really going to change your workflow, but understanding that it's going to run faster in certain tasks, and if that is a task you're doing, it's going to make a difference. So I'm going to rely heavily on data extrapolation, and that's something that's definitely going to help out. Because I'll also say that we are in the 3rd generation of these SoC already. The effect of SSD and RAM is already known at this point, and you can easily see in the charts that I'm sharing with you. Here's how you can read the spec on the machine. I'll leave a timestamp back this as well. If you're unsure what the machine means, this would be the chart that you want to look at. All right, let's take a look at SSD. The moment you configure this, you cannot upgrade it. Now, some have argued that there are micro solderings that can be done, sure, but it's not something that me and you can literally just pop the back of our machine to do it, and it does cost to upgrade as well. So for the most part, it is non-upgradable. But the one thing about SSD is you can always plug in an external drive and expand the storage on your machine, so you're not stuck with what's just really built in. As far as SSD goes between these two machines, I mean, you're looking at performance that are not really quite on par. So the Max is running on a faster one, but not only that though, we're talking about 512 versus 1 terabyte, and that's probably the variation we're seeing. I know ideally I would configure this so that it has 36 gigabyte memory, 1 terabyte SSD, but that's also another costly machine to get in the studio to run tests as well. So this is going to have to serve for now. These are all the M3 generations compare, so you can see how the 512 are performing pretty much similar to each other until you're really just getting to the M3 and it's not really performing quite as fast. And we are really starting to see that M3 in this generation, even with the 512, is lagging a little bit, even though it is over 3 gigabytes per second. Now, when I say lagging, it's probably like maybe a minute longer in the most intensive tasks like Photoshop 56 gigabyte. So personally for me, I don't think that is really a big deal. And especially if you don't work with those day in, day out. Here's the SSD speed for all the inner machines. You can pause this to see a little bit more. Now, some of you have asked if I store the asset, the pictures, the video files internally versus externally, are we going to see a difference in performance? The answer to that is nil, and I'll leave a link to this video that I've done extensive tests in the description so you can check that out. As far as memory go, this is where you really need to be careful. Consider your use case. If you're like me, have too many browsers, tabs, too many programs running, just get more RAM for your system. It's fast memory that your system can tap into right away without having to compress and write everything to the SSD and pull it out again. And you're also going to be utilizing SSD a lot more too, because there are also wearing on the SSD can happen. So consider RAM more carefully than I would say SSD. So that would be the first thing. Remember too that it is not upgradable once you have configured this. It's not that somebody can do micro soldering. You can't do any of those things to the RAM, and you cannot plug in an external drive and expand the RAM in the system. That is something that cannot be done. Remember too that it is shared between the CPU and GPU, and that less memory is still less memory, so less is not more. And if you're doing this professionally, just get more memory in your system. You'll be thankful for that. As far as recommendation go, I say this in all my video. If you're a pro, you're on a Mac, restart your system, launch Activity Monitor, go into the memory tab, and look at the memory pressure. Tile your windows in a way that when you launch your creative app as you go through your day, you can monitor the memory usage. If you're green, you're good. Yellow, you should consider getting more. Red, you definitely need to bump that up. Another program that works really well for me is iStat Menu, because it keeps track of your history for 30 days. And I really prefer this program, so links to this program will be in the description. If you're coming from an Intel One, advice that you have is to keep the RAM pretty much on status quo, which is the same as you already have in your Intel system, if not more. Don't go down because it's unified memory. Don't think that way. That's not a good formula for pro workflow. So keep it the same or bump it up. Now for pro, I recommend going with at least 32 gigabytes of memory at the very minimum, if not 36 in the current generation machine. And part of the reason why is because you have to remember too that the operating system is already using the memory as you start it up and run. It can take anywhere between 6 to 10 or 11 gigabytes of memory. So even though you may have 16 or 18 gigabytes, not all of those are available for you to run your apps. And if you use Adobe apps, they use a lot of memory, so definitely consider getting more. Now let's take a look at Lightroom Classic 13.0.1, one-to-one preview for 1000 Nikon D850 file. If we take a look at the timing variation between the two, it is approaching that 5-minute mark. And I would say that this is quite substantial. Now, if we take a look at the core distribution, it's 12 and 14, and it's just 2 more CPU cores. It doesn't seem like it would really attribute to that much of variation. But the way how this CPU core are distributed does make a difference. And by the way, this is just a CPU-based task. So on the Pro is 6 performance, 6 efficiency, whereas on the Max is 10 performance and 4 efficiency. That extra 4 performance core is really attributing to this time variation. And we're going to see if this trend continues or not. Now, the other thing that you may be asking is, what happened if I bump this to 36 gigabytes of memory? Am I going to see a time improvement? And the answer is that for this specific task, not so much. You're going to be very similar to where you are now. If we take a look at this comparing to the rest, this is pretty much the base M3 Max. And if we compare this to the top spec M3 Pro, this is where they are on the chart. Somewhere in the middle, but this, as I said in other videos, is already encroaching on the ultra territory. All right, let's continue with export for these 1000 Nikon D850 file to full-size JPEG. With this, we have more CPU, more GPU core, better distributed. This one has less, and this also has more memory in the system. This one has less. The thing is that we're talking about 22 seconds variation. This is really not that big of a difference at all. So you really need to start to take a look at this down into the details a little bit more. Let's continue to see how this performs. But before we do that, let's compare this. So M3 Max base and the M3 Pro top configurations right there. Interestingly enough, the M3 Pro base configuration is performing better than this one by a few seconds and is really close to the M3 Max. Go figure, I mean, that one has even less CPU and GPU core. Now, this is telling me that Lightroom Classic is definitely not optimized for these laptops and these silicons just yet. So there is a lot of those wonkiness going on. Lightroom Classic HDR Merge, Nikon D810 file, comparing these two together, the timing is 1 second apart. This is within a margin of error. And if we take a look at this, we can see that the M3 generation are clustering up at the top. Interestingly enough though, if we go back just quickly to take a look at that chart, we can see that the M3 Pro is pulling ahead by 1 second. But like I said, this is pretty much within the margin of error, and we're not going to worry about that much. Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge. This is taking 14 Nikon D810 to create a 314 megapixel DNG file. For this, it is quite substantial. Now, the explanation for this is that first is RAM. It's really RAM heavy, and secondary is CPU. So when you have 18, this is what's really attributing to taking it longer. And when you have 36 on here, this is what's really reducing a lot of that time, because there's enough RAM in the system to do all this computation on the fast memory. And this is also something to think about as well, which I don't have this M3 Pro machine in the 36 gigabyte configuration to test in the studio, but I generally think that that will bring this task much closer in time to each other. So with this, if we take a look at the time, this is pretty much just the factor of the memory in the system. 128 at the top, 16 gigabytes of memory at the very bottom, and you can see the distribution for all of those. And when we take a look at this chart, this is pretty much the base M3 Max compared to the M3 Pro top SoC, which is that red line right there. So you can see between this yellow graph right here and also that red line, the comparison between how they fit in with the rest. And now let's take a look at AI Noise Reduction, which now the task is running on the GPU, even though it's supposed to be running on the NPU, the neural processing engine. However, there are color shifting that happens and artifacting, which is why it's not running on that just yet. But if we take a look at this timing, we can see that the increase in the GPU on the system is attributing to a much faster time by 15 seconds. And you may say it's 15 seconds for one picture is really not a big deal. The moment you really start to compound this by hundreds of pictures, this is really going to start to make a big difference quick. So another factor to really think about. This is why I also argue that for any pro, especially if you're working with the photo app, Lightroom Classic, for instance, getting a Max is not a bad consideration now, because the apps are now going to use the GPU core in many more tasks than we think about. And when this really goes to the NPU, I mean, it may make a difference, but there are still other tasks that still uses the GPU on the system, and having more of that is definitely something that is helpful. So when we take a look at the M3 Max, that is the timing for that right there. And the top M3 Pro, this is the timing that we are looking at right now. So you can see that the amount of memory, it's not really the big factor here. Most of the time, it really has to do with the number of GPU cores on the system. As you start to scale up in a GPU, this is pretty much going to be determining the speed of how this runs. All right, this is Lightroom Desktop version 7. And on the export, this is using the CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination together. And when we take a look at this, there is a time variation. It's close to doubles, not really quite that, but it is definitely much longer. And this is also significant enough. Now, most of us pros are not really using Lightroom CC, but if you are, this is a good number for you to see. And here it is when we match this up with the rest of the chart. So M3 Max base, performing fairly well there. And we're talking about an M3 Pro top specs. So let's find that in the chart. So this is pretty much right there. And you can see the timing is much longer. So it depends on how fast you want to do something. But you also need to think about too, is this time variation? Yeah, it is significant enough that I would say the $800 bump may be worth it. But this is ultimately going to depend on your workflow. Capture One 23, 16.3.0.76. So for this, having more CPU core help, having more performance core definitely does help, but it helps by about 1 minute and 8 seconds. Not the most impressive, but we're not looking at Capture One for this. The reason why we're showing Capture One is so that those of you who use Capture One can make the best decision and not really just overbuy the machine for the program not to run efficiently on it and spend a lot of money. When we take a look at the M3 Max base, it's sticking right up there at the top. And the M3 Pro 1218 is almost right there. And the M2 Ultra is right there at the top too, but it's taking much longer. And that has way more CPU cores on the system, way better distribution and performance and efficiency core. None of this really makes sense. Now let's take a look at the export. So with this, an increase in 12 GPU core is showing some time variation between the two, but you can see there, and you have to determine if saving that 6-7 minutes is really worth it for you, not more like 6.5 minutes or so. And you can take a look at the timing there. So if this is worth it for you, this may be worth it to go for that $800. But when we really show you this on the chart with all of the machines, it will be surprising because, for example, the M3 Max base SoC is right there. And also the M3 Pro top spec is pretty much there. Now, the machine that I would argue is one of the best right now for Capture One would be the M2 Max and the base SoC one, because you can get that now for an even lower pricing, and timing is actually pretty impressive because it is grouping together with the top M3 Max machine still. So if you're just running on Capture One, that would be my advice. Now let's take a look at Photoshop. For this, I'm still using Digitaloid Test, and I'll leave a link to his website in the description. Pujae Test will be coming later on once they're out of beta on Apple Silicon. These are the 3 tests I'm doing, and now let's take a look at the time for Photoshop speed. Between these 2 machines, they're just milliseconds apart. And this is also the reason why if you are just doing tasks in Photoshop mostly, I recommend getting the M3 Pro and just bumping up the memory to 36 gigabyte. And if that is enough memory for you, you have a really fantastic machine to run Photoshop with because it is fast. Because when I show you all the rest in combination, you can see that the M3 machine are clustering right at the top when it comes to just the speed performance. And Photoshop is really going in there and utilizing the CPU cores on these computers much better than the previous generation. Don't get me wrong, the previous generation machine are only about a second longer. But if you do this day in, day out, this is something that's worthwhile and definitely something to think about. All right, Photoshop Medium, 15.7 gigabyte file. This is filling this memory up already. It has to go into the swap on the SSD, and that's why we're seeing a huge time variation. When we increase the memory from 70 to 90, we see a time reduction. That is a good thing, but this is telling us 2 things. It's telling us that on the max 36 gigabytes of memory, it's still running on the memory between these 2 tasks. Timing is pretty much identical to each other. When it comes to this one, there is more memory, and you can see by just increasing the memory on the system from 70 to 90, we are reducing a time by quite a bit, close to 4-second mark. So if we start to really extrapolate this result out, you can see that adding more memory, if you work with larger Photoshop file, is going to be something that makes sense. Taking a look at this, these are the machines at the very top that has more memory, not so much faster CPU cores, although that is playing a role as well, which is the reason why the M3s are at the very top. So those are things to really think about in this particular task when you're really taking a look at this. If you're constantly working these files, just do yourself a favor, upgrade the memory on the system because you're going to save a lot of time. For instance, look at the 32 compared to the 16. It is quite substantial. Photoshop huge. This is a 56 gigabyte file. If you work with this on a daily basis, you're definitely not looking at getting a machine with just 16 or 18 gigabytes of memory. You would have already gone in and configured more. But if you only work with this every now and then, you're really talking about a minute and 28 seconds longer. It's really not that big of a deal to just wait that much longer considering how large the file is. I know it's frustrating, but the variation is really not quite as large as you think. And with this, if we bump this up to 36, we would decrease the time that it would take to run this task as well. When we add this to the rest of the lineup, a couple of things happen. Having more memory at 128 is definitely doing that much better than having 16 that sits at the very bottom of the chart. M3 Max base SoC is right there. M3 Pro, this is the top one. It's pretty much that green line right there. So you can see it's pretty much right in the middle. Nothing as impressive, nothing as surprising, just that more memory in the system is attributing to the time reduction. So if you want to really think about how fast your machine is going to run when you increase the RAM, it will be a task like this or some of the other tasks like Panorama Merge. But other than that, you're not going to see that much of a variation. All right, encoder decoder engine in Final Cut Pro 10.6.10. This is the main reason why I recommend anyone working with video going with the Max machine, because you have double the encoder decoder engine, and that really cuts the time down by almost half when you're really looking at this. Comparing this with the rest of the chart, you can see that the Pros are sticking together with the regular SoC, and the top one, the Max and the Ultra, are a little bit closer together in that regard, with the Ultra sitting at the very top still. So if you do a video, like I said, this is something to consider. Now, another thing I also want to comment on as well is that when I'm working with this particular type of clip that I work with, it's functioning perfectly fine. It's smooth on my timeline. I don't have any extensive need for video. So if you have a lot more extensive need, it's one of those things that it might not run as smoothly, but here's the thing, having double the encoder decoder engine, even when you're doing the rendering, is going to help cut that time by a lot as well. So that's another thing to consider, the Max or the Ultra. Timing on the Max on this one gets cut by about half as well, and you can see that right now, close to half, and we can see that the Max is performing better on these export. Now let's take a look at ProRes. Fairly close to each other, so if you work at ProRes, you have a lot more leeway because all the machines are clustering pretty much right in near where each other are. So those are some of the things to think about. Adobe AfterEffects. This is using Adobe Benchmark. Let's take a look at the result. I'm sharing with you two results here. So by default, it's using the Mercury software, which is CPU only, and you can go in and enable hardware acceleration, Mercury hardware engine that uses the GPU. However, when you use the GPU, color artifacting happens, color might not match, and so forth. So a lot of things can happen from there, which is why I'm running both, but by default is running on CPU. Now, interestingly enough though, if you just take a look at these two machines grouped together, when we enable the GPU, it's only performing better by a few seconds. What's really more important is that regardless of if you use CPU or GPU on these, the Max one is still performing much better than the Pro machine. So if this is a task that you do, I highly recommend choosing a Mac, but this is also getting into the video arena, which is also something that I have already recommend the Max for anyway. So if I have denoted GPU, you can see that these are the GPU and CPU tasks. You can take a look at all these in combination and see how they perform against each other right there compared to the rest. Analysis, thoughts, and observation. For this, we are going to have to look at the lineup. Let's start with the 14-inch one. And granted, I have tested the 16-inch machine. What we were really looking at is the M3 Pro top versus the base M3 Max. And when we take a look at these two in combination, there are certain tasks where the Max with more CPU, more GPU, better distribution is doing that much better. But you also have to remember too that this really represents an $800 price tag variation. $400 for the SoC and another $400 for the accompanying memory upgrade, because the Max will only run on 36 and you cannot run that on 18. So that would be something to think about. Now, if you're just configuring the 14-inch machine and you're on more of a budget, my recommendation is as follows. Go with the M3 Pro base SoC, upgrade it to 36 gigabytes of memory, and I think you have a really great performance machine right there. Don't worry about getting the extra 12 core CPU and 18 core GPU. Is not really going to show you that much of a difference. In fact, I'm going to leave a link to this video that I have done the test in the description. I highly recommend you check it out because you're going to see the performance variation is really small, and the base M3 Pro is really proving itself to be an amazing machine at a really great value. So here's the thing, save the $200 upgrade SoC there, use that $200 to bump up the memory. So instead of paying, well, if you want to think about it this way, instead of paying $400 memory, you're just paying $200 more. Even though, yes, it is $400. I do understand, but I am giving you a rationale for decision making. So I would totally forget about this and just use that money that you would upgrade SoC that you're going to see very little from and upgrade the memory. You're going to see a much better performance on tasks that use RAM. When it comes to the 16-inch model, the Pros, they're pretty much the same. Top M3 Pros, and we are now looking at the base M3 Max. Personally for me, if you can really stretch it, I would say that the base M3 Max is a really much better machine overall, much better all around SoC for you to use in your pro workflow. But if that does become a lot for the budget, one thing that I do recommend is just going with this configuration and bumping it up to 36 gigabytes of memory, and that will take you quite a long way as well. It won't take you a long way on tasks that requires both CPU and GPU, but on a task that takes memory and many apps you're running in Adobe software, it's definitely going to help out a lot. So base M3 Max, if you take a look at that, we can do this and you have 36 gigabytes of memory. The only dilemma here is to upgrade the memory on this machine to 96 gigabyte, 2.6 times more, it's $800. That is a fairly hefty price tag. And I wish there was something in between, but there is really none. The only way to really get to any of those in between one is if you spend the $300 to upgrade SoC and then really choose between all these memory in the lineup to upgrade. And what this is really going to come down to at the end is how much memory do you need in your workflow? I don't know. I'm so in between right now, but I really can't see that much value in justifying for the Max. And I'll leave a link to my other video as well where I compare the base Max versus the top Max, and I definitely recommend you check that out as well. Now, something to really think about. These are both the 14-inch machine. This is the M3 Pro and this is the M3 Max. When we start to match the components, for example, 36 gigabyte memory, 1 terabyte SSD between these two, you're really just looking at the price of a silicon upgrade of $400. So that's really what it really comes down to, and you really need to determine in your workflow based on the chart I'm sharing with you if this is worthwhile or not. If you want to have a machine that you're going to wait the least amount of time for it to finish the task, then yes, definitely go for the Max. There's no doubt about that. This is the 16-inch one for both of these, the Max and the Pro. So Pro's on the left, Max is on the right. This has pretty much come not quite close to it, and I want to just show you this. When we upgrade the memory to 36, for instance, we are taking a look at this price tag, 36 gigabyte memory, which is pretty much the same there, but this is still running on the top M3 Pro. So this is giving us some idea as far as pricing variation between these two machines, and it is still substantially apart. And this may be an option that would be good for you to go with as well, especially if you choose the 16-inch one. And as we start to see, when it gets to the Max, the performance is that much better. It is the most impressive Max, but the path to really go in and choose between the Max and the top and really choosing the amount of memory it's not quite as straightforward as we would like it to be. So which one do you choose? You already seen the chart. I would really highly recommend that you examine your workflow, and I have made this chart for us for good, better, best. And if you're running Lightroom Classic, I mean, the Max is definitely a good contender, but if you want just a really good machine, I mean, the M3 Pro is holding on its own just fine. But I would also consider the previous generation M2 and also M1 as well, because those are still really great price machine that have also been coming down in value quite a bit, especially on Apple Refurb Store. So that would be what I would recommend, either that or on the secondhand market. When it comes to Photoshop, I definitely recommend going with the M3 Pro. Upgrading to 36 gigabytes of memory on that one is really a good contender. If you need anything more than that, well, then you have to really start to go with the Max option and also the dilemma between memory upgrade. Something to think about there. Capture One, we've seen in the result already. M2 Max is probably the best one right now at a good value, or if you're just going to go get another Max SoC, just look for the base one if you can save the money, because you're not going to gain that much more performance between choosing the base versus the top Max, and I highly recommend the base one. Final Cut Pro, any video work, highly recommend the Max or the Ultra. Double encoder decoder engine really cuts the time for many of the renderings that happen by almost half compared to the regular Pro, and that's something that's worth it. As far as RAM go, minimum 1618, which is already there on many of these machines, but my optimal number would be 32 or 36, if not more, for Pro. So if you're doing this professionally, you're making a living and you're getting income from this, I highly upgrading more because you're going to get way more out of your machine. And regarding SSD, 512 is already the minimum, which is good, but I still recommend consider getting 1 terabyte because that might last you longer as well. But that's one of the more variable ones that's not quite as necessary as the memory. When you take a look at this upgrade chart, just remember that the M1, M2, and M3, these are more just the consumer-oriented SoC. So you can do so much with them, but there's going to be a limitation. And when you start to look at the Pro, the Max, the Ultra, and as you do this for a living, those are going to be the better all-around SoC you can choose, and they're also going to come with better SSDs and so forth in the system as well that is going to really support that chip throughput and performance throughout. The best way to use this upgraded chart is you can even do like what I'm doing on the iPad right now. Circle the silicon that you're on and you can just follow the arrow and decide where you want to upgrade. For instance, you had the M1 Pro, going to the M2 Ultra or even the M1 Ultra is not a bad idea. I mean, going from the M1 Pro to the M2 Max and not having to go to the M3 Max, it's still a really good idea as well. So there's really many upgrade paths that you can really choose from. And I even include that in the M3 as well, even though you just got one of these, chances of you really going to this path is not there immediately. But it is something to note on all these gradient, how you can really go and upgrade this machine. The other thing that I also will point out as well is that the M2 Max going to the M1 Ultra is still one of those things where you can jump back that way and you're going to get good performance out of this. All right, so as we can see, there's a lot of things to really consider when we start to take a look at the top M3 Pro versus the base M3 Max. It's not quite as clear cut as we think it is because to do that jump is a financial investment in your system. Do you really need to spend that much? Can you justify it? Personally, I think the M3 Max base is a really great SoC, but again, it's not for everyone and not everyone can stretch that budget. So I have given you a lot of extra factors to think about in addition to the performance. Give us some thoughts. If you have any questions or comment, let me know. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell for new, and we trust.